Welcome everyone to another episode of the Animal Rights Show. We have an action-packed hour planned for you. We're honored to be joined by guest panelist, longtime activist Mel Broughton, and he, along with the rest of us, are going to be exploring the issue of violence towards activists, as well as vegan responses to the often forgotten issue of vivisection or animal testing. And with that, let us know if you're here in the comments. We'll pull those in as soon as we can. And let's hear what's been happening in the world of animal rights this week. It's time for the news of the week.
I'm so excited. Big Red.
Oh, hi everyone. Just catching up on the news. So I've got two bits of news this week. So we have an update on the EU vote, which Wendy mentioned last week, regarding lobbying from certain animal agriculture factions. And the lobby was to basically try ban using words like veggie burger and veggie sausages. And this was actually voted down by the EU. So that's good news. There is actually another bit of legislation, which unfortunately the EU has introduced further restrictive measures, and that's regarding dairy replacements. So previously, products like almond milk, labeled like plant milks that were labeled with milk, or vegan yogurts, using the word yogurt, those that ban has been upheld, and they've actually introduced further restrictions on these products, so they can no longer be called cheese style or yogurt style. So this is going to have an effect on these products, and it could also impact like packaging styles of products. Will they be able to look like a dairy butter product or a milk carton product? So it's not really clear how that's going to pan out, as well as it might affect the labeling as well. So other companies might have to sort of invest in relabeling their products. And the last bit of news was based in the UK. So it's the introduction of the Animal Welfare Sentencing Bill. Obviously, this is largely welfare based. Comes under the Animal Welfare Act, and it's basically a change to punitive measures regarding animal cruelty offences, and it's an increase in prison sentences from originally 6 months to 5 years. So it's a tenfold increase, and it's kind of, there are various reasons why this has happened. I think it's politically seen as a win for the government, because they are coming out of the EU, so they want to change certain legislation to seem to be more progressive, and there were groups like the RSPCA who I think campaigned for this, and it's also deemed to be sort of our legislation around animal welfare was in the UK was deemed to be behind other EU countries. So yeah, those are the two bits of news. Back to the studio. Back to everyone else.
This has been the news of the week.
Let's just move on, shall we? Can we please move on, Reba?
Hey, we're in the studio now.
To the studio. I love that.
Sounds awfully official, doesn't it?
Yeah. Hey, actually,
a secret donor funding our studio.
I did see. Oh, don't mention donors. I did see Sandra Higgins was saying that a lot of vegans are kind of celebrating this EU thing, but it sounds like it's a real mixed bag. And in fact, from the dairy part of it, it looks like a bit of a loss. So it's quite serious. You're saying about you think it might even affect the fact you can't have a carton that looks like a milk carton. Is that what you're saying, Tom?
Yeah, that's what one source allegedly said, because I think there's still some ambiguity there. But you're right. It's a bit. I think in some ways it's hypocritical, given that these that they haven't sort of introduced these new words that can be used for plant-based milks and stuff like that. But what's interesting to me is that there is an initiative in the EU with regards to like environmental campaigns. So it's kind of ironic that they haven't recognized that there's a push to kind of be more environmentally friendly in that sense. So why they've done it for the vegan meat products, but not for the vegan dairy replacement products, I don't know. Strange.
Well, and there's an exemption for coconut milk. Is that right or not?
Good question. I don't know, actually.
Are we going to have to start buying that in coconuts if we can't buy it in milk containers anymore?
Well, it'd be
quite creative.
It'd be quite useful for throwing, I suppose.
Well, hello everyone who's joined us. Please let us know you're here in the comments. It's great to hear what your thoughts are along with these topics too. Hello to Deb, Rusty Can, Sharon, Jennifer, Bernie, and Karina. But yeah, I think it's an interesting topic, isn't it? Because the whole premise is that it's supposed to be more transparent labeling, and to me it does the opposite. If these long established words that people are used to with vegan in front of it are all of a sudden being called something else, I think it's just going to add to confusion.
Yeah, it should be called murder burgers.
Body part burgers. I think we should be able to call it both ways, shouldn't we?
Yeah,
what do we think?
I'm sorry,
Go ahead, Mel.
Yeah, I suppose it's an interesting juncture where we are now with this whole issue and this whole battle that it's now come down to an argument sometimes about language, about way things are described. In some ways, I see it as quite a positive thing, because I think once a society starts to have these conversations, we maybe are reaching a point where ordinary people are having to begin to understand, having to face the fact that things are changing significantly. I mean, I could never imagine these kind of conversations happening even 10 years ago. So, I mean, I don't know, maybe that I'm just looking at that from a more sort of holistic point of view, from the sort of bigger picture. But the very fact that these sort of things are happening, and are happening also in terms of the way things are described legally, and in terms of product placement, product production, I think is actually quite a positive thing. There are going to be ups and downs with it, but I still think it's testament to how far things probably are moving, particularly to do with obviously vegan products and vegan food.
I'd agree with that, because it's like when we look back at the victory, it'll be interesting to look back at what ended up being milestones, and we might not even recognize them as that right now, but it's kind of like retrospect thing. It's always the same. Things that you think are very important right now tend not to be, and then the things that are not tend to be. It's an interesting way that history judges things, I suppose.
No, absolutely. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, I think that is a very good point, and I think it's to do with historical. I think this will be looked back at as probably quite a pivotal moment in many respects.
It is kind of a sign of progress, isn't it? Because they wouldn't be pushing for these things if we weren't making some level of progress. Obviously, when it gets into vegan consumerism, that's a whole can of worms to liberate. But on the surface, it does seem like a sign of progress.
And I suppose realistically, we all know that behind this are the industries themselves, who are only too keen to make sure that we don't get these things labelled this way, and the change is kind of stopped or stemmed. So the more, I suppose, in some respects, the more this happens, the more it shows that this is an effective change. That's not to say the battles aren't going to be difficult. I think they are, but I suspect that this is a sign that there's a certain desperation setting in there in these industries, one that they're keen to try and stop or stem at very least.
What's interesting now is you do get the bigger corporations actually backing the plant-based side of things. Like I can't remember whether it was Nestle and someone else. I can't remember the two other companies we were looking at last time. But that's an interesting change, isn't it? In that you've got the might of the industries, the agriculture and the dairy industries, but you've also now got these big players who are producing plant-based products, who are then actually pushing to keep the names and things like this. So you've kind of, it's a whole mixed bag, isn't it? Very complex, actually. But yeah, very, very positive that it's in the mainstream conversation, at least. I agree.
And what do we think about this new so-called animal cruelty legislation? I mean, it sounds like it's mostly going to be targeting so-called, family members, dogs and cats and those species. It doesn't seem like it's going to do anything. I mean, as whether animal cruelty laws do anything to begin with, I guess, is another topic. But it doesn't seem like there's any protection for pigs, cows, chickens, turkeys.
I just heard the word cruelty and turned off, so you'll have to explain it to
me. We'll go to the tape. You can watch it back.
Where's Roger's exploding head?
No, that's the M word. That's the M word.
Oh yeah, that's the M word.
Might hear that later on.
No.
That kind of legislation is certainly speciesist, and I think it's happening everywhere. Something similar is happening here in Greece, with protesters gathering outside the courthouse during the trial of someone who stabbed a stray dog and asking for more severe punishment. And all these hundreds of people outside the courthouse were mostly non-vegans. So when the largest part of the population is non-vegan, legislation is bound to be speciesist.
Yeah, do you ever remember that case in Britain where I think a woman called Mary Bale, maybe, was filmed throwing a cat into a wheelie bin? And that created all kinds of news, and you know, I think she even got death threats and everything. And obviously, the cat wasn't killed, just imprisoned for a while in a wheelie bin, but obviously seen by the camera on the house. But that created an incredible kind of response, you know, again from non-vegans. Yeah,
I remember that really well, Roger, and it kind of did bring home very, very sharply that divide that is still there between, I suppose, vegan or the animal rights position and those that are still, you know, wedded to animal welfareism, which all our laws still are. I mean, let's be very clear about that. I mean, that's the position we're still in. And I think that story, particularly with the cat in the wheelie bin, really, to me, brought it into very, very sharp focus. And, you know, the hypocrisy of it, really, from the people who were outraged, who were almost certainly all of them, or most of them, most likely, like you say, were probably consumers of animal products, people who had never even given a second thought to, you know, what animal rights is, but are suddenly completely outraged by this image of the cat being put in the wheelie bin. And I think we're still in that position, aren't we? Despite the advances that have been made that we were talking about earlier with vegans, when it comes to this divide between the way society views animals, and let's call it the idea of them having basic rights, and the way they've always been viewed by society, you know, whether it be from religion, philosophy, science, or whatever, is that they are not deserving of that. And these kind of incidents just keep highlighting that deep division that, although it, you know, in some respects it is being eroded, but in a fundamental way it's still very, very real, and in a way, you know, unmoved. And I think that's still the biggest challenge to all of us in, you know, in whatever we do, you know, when we're campaigning for animal rights or promotion of veganism or whatever it is, or even out in the hunting field. And it's something that is still a long way off, if we're all honest. And it's slow, and it's at times excruciatingly slow. And I often feel that I've always been frustrated by probably the lack of realism in the movement, whether it's the vegan movement, the animal rights, or whatever you want to call yourself. I've always been frustrated by the fact we were always pretty good at activism, but we've never been particularly great, I don't think, in linking that with a kind of more legal approach to animal rights, a more legal definition of what animal rights actually is. Now, I know I've been on about this before, and sometimes I sound a bit fuzzy. In my own mind, I know what it means, even though I can't quite get it across all the time. But to me, it's even within our own movement, it's an issue, let alone the public at large, is that sometimes misunderstanding of what animal rights is and isn't.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's might be a nice segue to our next topic, which involves violence against activists, specifically around fox hunting here domestically, because it is considered to be illegal.
Before we go there, Jeremy, Ian says that the audio of the news thing almost blew the roof off. Well, I'm not so sure about that, but
yeah. Hello, Ian and Moose and Kristen and Elliot.
There's some more. There's some more audio coming, so just be ready with your volume button. And hello, Mama Hess. I see Mama Hess is in the room, and Elliot says, "Am I on the right show?" Okay.
Definitely animal rights, not animal wrongs. So it is the right show.
It's the animal welfare show, folks.
With that, I think let's go and Roger put together a lovely intro clip for this next segment. So
I'm not quite sure. Lovely.
Let's rephrase
you know
that.
when those words start to exit the mouth, and yeah. Anyway, it's a very moving clip, shall we say? So and do be aware it does involve violent acts. So shield yourself to that if you feel it's necessary.
This is a little film I put together showing violence towards the SABs. So as a content warning, do take care if you've been a victim of that kind of stuff. The clips come from the West Midlands SABs and the West Yorkshire SABs, the East Kent SABs, the Sussex SABs, and also the Sheffield SABs, more of which later.
Hi, I need the police urgently. A tractor is just smashing into my car and driving me off the road. It's still doing it. It's still doing it. It's still doing it.
I don't give two fucks about that camera, and in a minute I'll take it off you and I'll chuck it in that pond. I'll chuck you with the fuck.
And if I could catch you away from that camera, I'd kick your teeth in. You'd never forget me.
So you don't think this matters then?
What? No, it doesn't matter.
But it's illegal, isn't it?
A lot of things are illegal.
So this is pretty standard stuff as I remember it from my sabbing days. This again is footage from the Sheffield huntsman.
He's got a hammer in his hand. Shit.
He's got a hammer. He's got a hammer.
Keep filming.
Oh my god!
Shit.
No, we can't leave. We can't leave. We can't leave.
No, keep filming.
Keep filming.
Do people film?
Yeah, so back in the day, yes, the 1980s, the Sheffield SABs were part of the campaign against the Hazleton laboratory, just to bring some threads together for today. And this is the BUAV Liberator news paper about that when we got some documents out of the laboratory. The results of the tests were eventually placed into this book by Robert Sharp, a friend of the SABs. So finally, this is the friend of the show and someone who runs the Back into Daylight Animal Rescue Centre, Declan Bowens. This is injuries he sustained at the Ward Union hunt in Ireland. Now, it was once thought that once these hunts were banned, the SABs would just become monitors like the League Against Cruel Sports. But as you can see, the sabbing continues, and that's because the hunting continues illegally as well, and also of course the police do not enforce the law, so the SABs sadly still needed. So this is Roger Yates back in the studio, your roving reporter. Yeah, no, the one thing I missed out from that report was a very frequent type of assault on SABs, which has been run down by horses. In other words, the hunters use horses as weapons. And that's what happened to Mel recently. So first of all, Mel, maybe you can give us an idea of what happened. And I think the question that we're all wanting to know is, how are you? Are you okay?
I'm okay, yeah. Obviously, this happened 8 weeks ago yesterday. I'm recovering well. I'm doing lots of physiotherapy. I have my next X-ray next week to check on my injuries. The injuries I sustained were multiple fractures, including 6 broken ribs, broken collarbone, broken shoulder blade, and a tear on my lung. So yeah, the injuries were quite extensive. But I am getting over it. I was out with the SABs yesterday in role as a navigator, so I didn't actually come out of the van. But I was keen and have been to go back to the hunt to show that despite what happened to me, I wasn't going to be put off or cowed in any way, and I'm not going to be. So back to the event. It was the 5th of September. Obviously, I'm going to be slightly careful what I say here. There is a police investigation ongoing. I have made a statement. My witnesses have made statements. My hospital records have now been handed over to the police. But essentially what happened was I was out with a number of other SABs at a meet of the Pytchley Foxhounds not far from Market Harbour in Northamptonshire. We were riding around when we spotted the hunt. And in classic, I should say this was a cub hunt. And in classic cub hunting tradition, we could see the riders surrounding a small cover on the top of a hill. 4 of us alighted the vehicle and began to make our way up the hill towards the hunt.
Yeah, just to jump in, Mel, just to explain for people, cub hunting is when they confine the cubs in a cover, which is a name for a wood, rather than actually flushing them and chasing them, right?
Yes, that's correct. And also, what's important to remember here, this is training young hounds. So 50% of those hounds will be new young hounds. Now, the point here is hounds don't naturally want to run all after a fox and rip it to bits. They have to be taught to do it. And it's interesting that in the post-ban era, the first question is, well, why are you training hounds to do something that's already illegal? Anyway, on arriving at the cover, we could see that the riders were in traditional cub hunting fashion. And another thing to mention here is hunts don't call it cub hunting. They call it autumn hunting. They don't like the word cub hunting in there, so they euphemistically call it autumn hunting. And they dispense with the red coats and wear greens and browns. Again, it's all for show, but cub hunting is what it is. It's to train young hounds to kill foxes. So on arriving at the wood, we were greeted by a number of terrier men who were, again, a strange feature of an activity that's supposed to be banned, that terrier men are even there. But there you go. They were there, and they were there on about three different quad bikes, 2 or 3 of them on each bike. And immediately, the first thing I said to them was, we've caught you cub hunting. This is an illegal act. You're involved in illegal activity. You're training hounds to do something that's already illegal. That statement was immediately met with violence straight away. I was confronted by a terrier man. I was grabbed. I was knocked to the floor. And this continued against the 4 of us for some minutes. And then one of the terrier men approached me, grabbed hold of my body camera. We all wear body cameras mounted on our chests. It's a form of defense and also the only realistic way you've got of recording what happens and hopefully any prosecution in the future. Mine was immediately yanked and snapped straight off the harness. I tried to get it back off the terrier man. I was knocked to the ground again. Within minutes, one of my colleagues was also attacked in the same way. Quad bike raced at him, jumped off, grabbed him, smashed the camera out of his harness, which means we had 1 camera left between 4 of us, and that was held by another colleague of mine who was holding a hand camera. We tried to work our way around the wood. We attempted to call the hounds out the wood. It was clear they were slapping their saddles. It was clear they were trying to scare any cubs that may be trying to get out the wood back in so the hounds could deal with them. Eventually, the new hounds would learn off the older hounds what to do. In other words, kill the cubs, which naturally they actually wouldn't want to do. As we made our way around this small cover, the remaining camera we had was targeted by one of the mounted riders who came up behind the Sab, grabbed him by the hair, pulling great clumps of hair out his head, and then he was then assaulted by another terrier man who smashed the camera, smashed the lens on it, and the camera stopped working, which meant at that point we had no recording equipment left between the 4 of us. As I made my way round the corner of the wood, the person who assaulted me, who I won't name for legal reasons, was behind me, maybe some 50, 75 meters behind me. I had my back to him. I was walking away. I was not engaged at that point in anything other than walking away. And then he set off at a gallop. Now, bear in mind, this was an open field. He could have gone any direction he wanted. And the next thing I remember was turning and the horse was on top of me. It hit me full force. I can't begin to describe this. I've never been hit by a car before, but I can only assume that's what it feels like. I remember just this, I turned and there it was. It was just full gap there. It was literally inches from me and bang. I remember going down, and I know people talk about when moments freeze in time and you have that thought. I thought I'm going to die. I'll be perfectly honest with you. I just said, my time's up. I saw the hooves going over me, and I thought, this is it, it's the end. Thankfully, the hooves missed me. And the next thing I remember is I just let out a scream. The pain was just instant. It just rushed all over my body. I was in agony, absolute agony. I knew there must have been broken bones. I didn't know what. I was struggling to breathe. And then I hit the floor. I looked to my side and I saw the person in question gallop away and not look back at all. He just kept on going, nothing. He didn't know whether I was alive or dead. And then two of my colleagues came running over. One of them attempted to run after the assailant, but quickly realised there was no point and came back. And then the third SAB joined me as well as I lay there. And I was screaming. I make no bones about it. I was screaming. I was in real pain. An ambulance was called immediately, 999. And I lay there probably, I don't know how long. It must have been 25, 30 minutes. The ambulance couldn't find me. We were in a field. The other SABs were having difficulty giving them directions. Eventually, they did arrive at the bottom of the field. It was quite a steep hill. Two paramedics got out the ambulance and were led up by one of the other SABs to where I was. And I remember, I don't know if any of you have done this. If you're in a lot of pain, sometimes you kick out with another limb to try and take the pain away somewhere else. I was kicking the floor that hard that I dug a small hole with my right boot because I was even trying to just get the pain away from where it was. The paramedics arrived and immediately put an IV line in my arm and started giving me morphine. I was struggling to breathe properly, and there was an issue that they said they tried to get the ambulance into the field and it got stuck. They couldn't get it up the hill, and so they then called for a air ambulance. So probably a further 10 minutes, 15 minutes. So by now, I think I'd been there 40, 45 minutes. And in that time, one thing I do remember is at one point I heard a noise, and this was probably about 10 minutes after it happened. I saw all the quad bikes go by in all the field. No one looked over, nothing. And also, I also now know that another SAB vehicle had arrived in the intervening time, and 3 more SABs had alighted the vehicle and had caught the hunt, still hunting. They were still cubbing. They knew there was somebody lying in the field. They didn't know if I was alive or dead, but they were actively still cubbing as if nothing had happened. And these other SABs then tried to intervene again. Anyway, the air ambulance eventually arrived, and as I said, I was then put in a head brace onto a board. And then I remember hearing a conversation about which hospital we were taken into, because they thought at that point I may have had a partially collapsed lung or collapsed lung. They were talking about taking me to Coventry, and then they decided, no, we'll take him to Northampton. And I was put in a helicopter and we took off. And ironically, the helicopter landed on the field where my school was when I was a kid. They've now pulled down. And it actually landed where I used to go to school. And the ambulance was, there was an ambulance on the other side of the field, and they pushed me across the field to an ambulance and drove me to Northampton General Hospital, where I was immediately taken into A&E. And then the process of being X-rayed and CT scans took place, and that happened for most of the day. And there was a concern about, they discovered that there was a tear on my lung, and there was a concern about it, my lung rupturing and all the complications that would go with that. But they decided that they'd put me onto a ward and monitor it. And so I went onto a ward probably Saturday tea time. And then I was repeatedly taken for X-rays Saturday night and the following morning. And they were still talking about what they were going to do about this tear on my lung. And then they established that I had 6 broken ribs. That's a broken collarbone, a broken shoulder blade, and this tear on the lung. And so I stayed in hospital again all day Sunday until midday Monday. And they gave me lots of painkillers. And they wanted me to stay, and I said, no, I want to go home. And they said, well, we'll let you go home. You've got to come back in the following week for further X-rays, which I did. And the problem was essentially with the fractures was that because my collarbone was basically smashed in 3 places and my shoulder blade was broken from top to bottom, he said the danger here is that my shoulder will completely drift out because of the fractures, in which case he said you will have serious problems ever using your arm again. He said I recommend an operation. He said obviously you've got to consider the fact that there was COVID in the hospital and everything else. He said we'll give you a week and see. When I went back the following week for an X-ray, the CT scan, they showed me the brakes, and even I could see that they were moving apart. He said, really, you have no choice here. If you don't have the operation, you're not going to use your arm properly ever again. And so the decision was made, and I was booked in a few days later, or in fact the following week, for an operation. So I went back in. I've now got a plate, a long plate across my collarbone, which is pulling it all back together, and an intensive physiotherapy. But one of the things that was interesting when I was talking to the orthopedic surgeon, he showed me some of the CT scans, and in my shoulder blade, there's a fragment of bone stuck in the break, the crack in my shoulder blade. And he said, what it is, he said, you were hit with such force that a fragment of my bone from my collarbone has travelled right back and lodged in the shoulder blade. And he said, well, ordinarily I'd want to operate, but in this situation, I'm going to leave it because it's a small fragment, and hopefully, as your shoulder blade heals, it'll grow around the fragment of bone. So I avoided a second operation. And as I say, right up to date, things are going okay. I'm getting a bit more use of my arm back. It's not great. It's still only about 50% or a bit less in some positions, but I am sort of getting there now. I've had, interesting enough, I've had a conversation last week. The police liaison officer who was acting between me and the officers investigating the case took a victim impact statement on me, and during it she actually said to me, well, Mel, how do you feel about it? And I said, how do you think I feel about it? I said, a guy tried to kill me, and you're seriously asking me how I feel about it? I said, I'm angry, and I think that's one of the things I'll say openly now. I'm very, very angry. The guy, in my own mind, the guy tried to kill me, and he's lucky he didn't. The hospital surgeon said, had he hit you in the head, you probably wouldn't be here now. Or had you been more central in your spine, he said you probably wouldn't ever walk again. And so the reality of this instance has sort of dawned on me more and more as the days and weeks have passed. I've begun to realise even more how serious it was and how much worse it could have been. And coupled with that, the fact that every week when I like Roger, I stabbed in the days when hunting was legal, and I regularly got arrested and put before the courts and got knocked about quite a bit. And since I've come back stabbing now, in the last 3 seasons, what I'm seeing is a return to that. Hunting's illegal, but there's no doubt the level of violence now is rising every week. Yesterday, a colleague of mine, I was in the vehicle, was put in a headlock and dragged to the floor just for trying to go onto a public footpath. I mean, they're not even bothering now. It's not even as if you're going onto private land, which again is only a civil matter. They're attacking people going onto public footpaths. They're attacking people trying to film a hunt from the road.
Yeah, what difference is made, Mel, by the technology? Because presumably your case is not going to be helped by the fact that you've got no film now.
Yeah,
I just
exactly,
wonder whether there's a technical way of actually live streaming these cameras, so even if they get smashed up, at least you've still got whatever you had before. Whereas presumably you've lost everything, right? In terms of
exactly, you're exactly right. And I fear what's going to happen in my case is that it'll go to CPS and they'll say no, there's no video footage evidence, and it'll get stopped. I really think that's going to happen. I think this guy's going to walk away. And I mean, I'll add that the man in question who did it to me was a paid member of Hunt staff. He's the whipper in. He wasn't just a bystander. He was a paid Hunt staff. Now, he was sacked within 24 hours of the incident. We know that. He was dismissed from the Poetry Hunt. But we also know from other instances like this that he'll be back. He will be back, if not with them, with another hunt, and he'll do it again next time. Who knows? But Roger's absolutely right. With the live streaming thing, we did actually look very recently at some GoPro cameras, which are quite expensive, but they do live stream. So the problem we've got, I suppose there's one issue with that, is that everything goes out. Every interaction goes out if you're live streaming, and that may raise some issues. But it is something that maybe is going to be a feature of hunt sabbing and hunt monitoring in the future.
You're meaning, Mel, that if you're live streaming, you've got to be careful with your language in particular. That's what
with your language in particular. That's what I'm saying. Yeah, I didn't mean to say being caught doing something illegal. But what I've learned,
if only the grassroots had a donor that can buy all this equipment, hey?
If only, I mean, we have invested in some new cameras since ours were starting, and they're better. They are better than what we had, but they're not up to the kind of standard that where you could live stream with. Those cameras do exist. I've read about them. I've looked at them. They are very expensive. I think it's £350 probably for each body cam. And if you're talking about kitting up a dozen subs in the field, it's no more an investment.
What about drone technology? Sorry, Wendy.
That's okay. No.
Drone technologies. We are now in possession of a drone, and we are people are training themselves. I'm not au fait with drone technology, and I know very little about them. I'm not qualified really. I mean, I've looked at some drone footage that the league have taken in the past, which was good. The problem here is, I mean, I don't know if you're aware of this. I was involved in a court case last year. I was assaulted quite badly by a man who was actually out yesterday. We had video footage of the assault. He got his hands around my throat on three occasions on a public footpath. The public footpath sign was on the video. He's clearly seen knocking me to the ground. When we went to court in Melton Mowbray, which is in the middle of hunting country, in the magistrates' court, the three magistrates actually actively aided in getting our video footage, a lot of it stopped from being shown. And the guy walked out of court. He got not guilty, even though he's quite clearly seen on the camera throttling me and then throwing me to the floor on 3 occasions. But I suppose this goes to the heart again of the problems we face with hunt violence and the police and the court system. But I mean, in Leicestershire, make no bones about it, it's not just that the police are not pursuing or acting on evidence they're given, because we do give it to them. It's that we know some of them are actively involved with the hunt. And I had an example last year where I was coming out of a field and I got attacked by a farmer and some stewards, and it was a rough one. I got thrown all over the place. As I got out the field onto the road, the police arrived. I went straight to the police, made my allegation, and arranged to make a statement. And then I walked up the road and I stopped for some reason. And the police were stood just out of sight in a gateway covered by a hedge. And for some reason, I decided to walk back, even though the hunt stewards are there and they were a rough lot. I decided to walk back. And as I walked back, I caught sight of the police laughing, joking, and patting these guys on the back. And you realise that it's not just that they're not bothering, it's that they're partisan, and that in many instances they just are actually pro-hunt. And that I find terrifying, absolutely terrifying, because as Roger also knows, we've had people die sabbing hunts, and we've had people very seriously injured, over the decades. And I suspect if you put a folder or a file together of all the attacks on hunt saboteurs and hunt monitors that have been hospitalized, it would be a massive file. But if you put another file next to it of convictions or court action against these people, it'd be tiny. And it's worrying. It's worrying for lots of reasons. It's worrying because it's a serious bar to us of being effective against hunts. But I think the question's even deeper than that. It's in a democracy, whichever, the belief is that if you have the evidence and the law is on your side, which it is, then you should have a reasonable expectation that you'll be protected, and equally that those who are guilty of breaching the law and using violence will be prosecuted. But I'm afraid if you talk to hunt sabs, and I'll talk particularly about the campaign I've been involved with over the last 2.5 seasons against the Cottesmore hunt, and we do them every week now, every week. And what we're seeing is just this steady level of sometimes quite what you call mundane violence almost. Get shoved, get knocked to the floor, you get thrown in a ditch. And now we see that as mundane. It's actually not mundane, but that's how bad it's got. We actually I expect to be treated like that, which is not a healthy state to be in when you think about it. So you expect to go out campaigning or monitoring something that a hunt that's acting illegally, and they are every week, and yet you also beginning to expect that you will be attacked and that nothing will happen. And sometimes, you know, you stop and think, well, how have we ever got to this situation? And I suppose that's a question that people have different opinions on. I've certainly got mine. I think there's a sense of entitlement within the hunting community. They have friends in high places. There's certainly you know, provable links between hunts and Tory politicians and government figures. So perhaps on that level, yeah, you can see why they. But it's this idea now that hunts can organise and recruit gangs of thugs. And I yesterday at the Cottesmore, I think there was something like 6 or 7 quad bikes. They're each carrying 3 hunt thugs. So you do the maths, you know, sometimes it's 9 or 10 plus a vehicle or 2. So sometimes you're facing 20 plus thugs who are just there. They're not there because they're interested in hunting. They're there to hand out and dispense violence against saboteurs and hunt monitors. And we've often...
Yeah, the terrier men have always been like that, though, haven't they?
The terrier men have, and the terrier men are there. But interestingly enough, certainly with the Cottesmore, the terrier men they will get involved, but they're not the main players in this. It's these other guys that are not hunt employees, have come from somewhere else often, are clearly in the employ of the hunt. And I've seen Hunt Marshal at the Cottesmore get onto his smartphone on his saddle, and within half an hour, you know, there are people coming for you. You know, it's no accident here. It's and as we're seeing each week now, these things are happening up and down the country with increasing and alarming regularity, and it feels like a return to the old days is coming, and with that comes the fear that someone's going to die again.
Mel, can I ask you pick up on a couple of things you mentioned? One, I love the fact that you're bionic now, by the way. Yeah. Bionic Mel. But
well, $6 million man, 62 man maybe.
Start moving
yeah, such a traumatic thing for you to experience. Thank you so much for sharing that with us as well, because it was traumatic just to hear it, so let alone what you went through, and getting back out there stabbing even after that yesterday and stuff. But coming back to you, because you said like you're really, really angry, which is not surprising. But how do you feel? And you're saying you're going out there now, you and the other SABs and SABs all over the country are now going out there with this expectation of being on the other end of violence and abuse, whether that's verbal or physical or threats of violence. How do you kind of face that? How do you reconcile that? And what do you do to deal with the anger from events like the one that you experienced 2 months ago? How do you deal with this on an emotional level?
It's a good question, actually. I was talking about, we had a long conversation about this yesterday, me and a friend of mine who was out, about how we deal with it. Some people drink. I do occasionally. And I'll be honest, I've come home and had a drink or 2 or 3, because all the emotion and the kind of physicality of it, you kind of have to let it out somehow. You just have to let it out. And what's interesting now, when we get in the van on a Saturday morning, is we get in there and we make a lot of jokes. There's like a lot of gallows humor going on now. There's an awful lot of it going on, because we're now all fully aware that one or more of us, or all of us, is going to get hurt every week. So there's a lot of kind of gallows humor, but there's also a very palpable silence falls over everyone just as we approach the hunt. It all stops. And everyone, you have to look in everyone's faces, and it's written on everyone's face. You know, it's like, well, we're going into, you know, whatever we're going into, and because it's becoming more and more prevalent, and we're dealing with more and more of these people, there's a kind of a grim kind of reality about it now. I mean, everyone is quite clear that they're not going to back down, but there is a mental. And I'll be honest and say that mentally, now, the first few weeks, I suppose I was in too much pain to really think about it, and I didn't. But in the last week or two, I have thought about it, and it has taken a bit of a toll on me. I've kind of experienced I've had some outbursts of real anger when I've been with people, and they've said to me, well, what's going on? I suddenly realised it's just pure anger. And I suppose that's one way of dealing with it, is you just let it out. Sometimes you don't mean to. I got into a really bad argument a couple of days ago with someone over nothing, and I realised, they said, well, what's up? And I suddenly realised it's just anger. It was just pure anger at what had happened, and it's happening with increasing frequency. And dealing with it is, people deal with it in different ways. I think some people just go very quiet. Some people get very, very angry and animated, and sometimes it just spills over. Even out in the field, occasionally, it happened to me yesterday. Even one of the guy who I was talking about earlier, who was involved in the court case, came up and banged on the passenger side window. I was sitting and started again. He was shouting through the window, "All right, Mel, how's your shoulder?" And I just exploded in rage at him, absolute rage. And then I suddenly stopped and realised it wasn't appropriate even for me to do it in those situations. You have to keep your mind on the job, but sometimes it's like that. I think it's different for everyone, but surely I've certainly seen the strain on people's faces who I sab with regularly, who are getting hit every week now and getting knocked to the ground and every single week, and you can see it in their faces. We haven't even started the main season yet, and already that kind of pressure is there. And when it's every week, and sometimes more than once a week, because sometimes we go out in the week as well, you never get that long enough break from it to adjust completely. You're back there again. You're back in that state of mind again. So certainly for me, it has affected me. I'll make no bones about it. I have these angry outbursts at the moment, and I suddenly realise what's going on.
I think it's pretty understandable. I don't think anybody will criticise you for that. Sharon says this community should raise funds for these cameras, and I completely endorse that idea. So Mel, it's quite a dramatic story, obviously, but it's also a common story, and also it's got a historical aspect to it. A lot of these kind of things have been going on for a long time. So we should move on to our second aspect, I think, and move on to vivisection. Should we, everybody?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think just real quickly, there's been an outpouring. I think this is just a small subset of the outpouring of positive comments to help offset some of those negative ones, Mel. There's just loads of people that are saying, hope you're well. And I think those will continue to come. So, I mean...
Well, could I just say that I'm not being... negative comments are what they are to me personally, but there are lots of positives. Like, for instance, I should say this, that we are successful as well. Yesterday, and if you go onto the North Hunt Sabs Facebook page, you'll see 2 beautiful films that were shot yesterday of 2 foxes escaping due to really clever action by Sabs in the field. I mean, really clever action on their part. And it's 2 lovely clips of film. Watch them and you'll see that, yeah, we win. We also win. And ultimately, we will win. Maybe it's quite a simplistic view here, but I think in the case of hunting, with something like 80% plus of the population are opposed to this, I mean, surely it's an issue that should be put to bed. Should have been put to bed a long time ago. And then I suppose in my heart of hearts, I think the hunt will actually in some ways destroy themselves. I think one of the big benefits of Facebook has been, and social media, is that these activities from the hunt are now being seen week in and week out by everyone. I think that war has been won by us completely. The fact that it's not being matched by legal action is something that we're going to have to push for. I mean, maybe we have to be more proactive on that side as well in putting the police and the courts under pressure to act, in favour of the vast majority of people in this country. And after all, the law is surely supposed to reflect majority opinion, not run against it. What a crazy situation to be in.
You would hope, yeah. And
think
to me,
so.
it underscores the violence and the multidimensional violence. You know, you've obviously got the foxes, but then the dogs, the horses, and now yourself as a human. I mean, the violence, you know, it's across multiple species. So, but yeah, as Roger says, we do have another segment, which I know you're deeply involved with as well. You know, have passion that lies there as well. And that's really talking about responses to vivisection. And what we'd like to do in this segment is share both a common response and then a rights-based response, and then we'll debrief and possibly look at it from a scientific perspective. It's time for the objection of the week.
So yeah, I think I could become vegan, but I do agree with animal testing because I think it's a matter of survival.
Do you know that animal testing is actually bad science? Most of it is not reliable. Something that is safe for a rat, it may not be safe for a human, and vice versa. So why torture all these animals? Why cause all this suffering when there are more advanced scientific methods that don't involve cruelty?
Yeah, but if it's a matter of my child being, you know, not getting ill and or my gran, you know, not being cured of cancer, then I'm afraid it's just one of those things. It's just a necessary evil. I'm really against animal cruelty, but it's just one of those things that I feel we have to have.
Yes, but it's really not necessary. I mean, every medication has to be tested at humans, on humans at some point, just to make sure that it's effective and safe. So the whole animal testing thing is quite old and necessary. There are more progressive methods to test medications and procedures. So why torture other animals?
Hello. Yes, I could be vegan. I'm pretty sure that I could change my diet, but I don't know about the animal testing side of things. I really do think it's just one of those necessary things. It's a matter of us surviving as a species.
Well, from an animal rights point of view, you know, we have to make it clear at the beginning that the animal rights position is not opposed to testing. It's just opposed to testing on other animals, in the sense that we'd also be opposed to testing on human animals. Because if you're in favor of vivisection, the most logical species to test on would be human animals. And of course, everybody would rule that out morally. The animal rights case just makes the same point in relation to other animals as well.
Oh no, you can test on prisoners for me. I don't care.
Yeah, well, they are also humans, and regardless of what they've done, they also have rights. Now, obviously, some of their rights are curtailed because of what they've done, but nevertheless, they still have basic rights. And the animal rights case is that other animals also have basic rights that would rule out that kind of operation on them.
I don't think that'd ever happen. I don't think they're going to start testing on humans before they put things out to market. And if it's a choice between, you know, a rat and my gran, then I'm afraid, I'm sorry, but the rat has to go.
Well, as I said, it's not really, you know, it's not the rat's problem that humans have problems. And so we have to find a way of testing without violating the rights of others. And so that's just our case, that we're not opposed to testing. We're all in favor of testing, so long as we don't violate rights. And so there's quite a lot of groups that would try and fund the so-called alternatives to vivisection or animal experimentation. We would be in support of that, because the idea is to stop the rights violations, whether that's be on humans or other animals.
This has been the objection of the week.
That explains a lot.
All sorted.
We're all back in the studio.
So I've got a question here that I think is quite interesting about this, the rights-based perspective and what we might maybe call the scientific argument against testing on other than human animals. Do we feel, and I know philosophically it's said that the two things are quite opposed to each other, like the rights-based view is opposed to the scientific view because it's irrelevant really from a rights-based point of view at the whether the experiments and the tests that are being done are beneficial, whether they are reliable, is actually irrelevant to a rights-based point of view, as Roger was just kind of putting across there in that little role play. However, does this mean that we should never put across the scientific argument because we feel that it's opposed to? Is it actually opposed to, or would it bolster and strengthen our argument because we can say, actually, we believe that this is morally and ethically wrong, and actually the science is beginning to prove that we're right because actually the science is very flawed as well. Can we not use it to bolster? What would everyone think about that? Are the two views opposed, or can they blend to make a stronger argument?
From my perspective, they can blend, and they do often blend. I mean, I as you all know, I mean, I are still protesting outside the Oxford Animal Research Lab every week, and I do have conversations, not so much recently because of the COVID situation, but I have had very long and sometimes complex arguments with people involved in animal research outside the lab. And one of the things that I often find is that they completely accept the moral argument, almost completely. And then when you get down to the scientific argument, you enter some very grey areas with them themselves. And they have often admitted to me that, yes, it is a very poor science, actually. Animal research is not a good science, and the but always is, there's nothing better at the moment, always at the moment. But then if you sort of push them on that and say, well, clearly the advancements in non-animal research are growing at a pace. And I'm, in fact, even on current levels, I'm fairly confident in thinking that a whole holistic approach using many different scientific disciplines, from cell lines to computer modeling to microfluid chips and all the other advanced technologies, is at least as good and better than the current use of animals. And they will kind of take a bit of a back step from that. And then they will often say, well, you're questioning my lifetime of expertise. And in fact, well, that's not what I'm doing. What I'm saying is that your expertise up until this point are what they are, but things have changed and are changing significantly. So the scientific community itself is clearly having deep questions about the relevance of animal research, and they are. I can tell you that from experience. I've heard it. I think one of the big problems is, and particularly you hear this at Oxford and other academic centres, is that, well, you're not telling me what to do. We have a long history of doing this. And it's as if they're using the past as some kind of justification for everything that happens going forward. So, despite the advances in scientific knowledge, that because they used animals before and because there is this history of animal use, that they somehow feel a scientific entitlement to continue to do that, even when they are confronted with an argument that actually says, well, no, that's not actually a very strong position for you to be holding now. In fact, it's weak. And I think that we're moving to a point now with the argument against animal experiments where the scientific argument and the moral argument have to be more closely entwined. And also, let's not forget that science is also very relevant in what we know about what animals think, feel, and are capable of experiencing. And that has grown at such a pace now that there can be no question at all that they are suffering, not just physically, but mentally and mentally as well in laboratory experiments. And that has to be an important element of this. So I think on a cost-benefit analysis alone, animal experiments are failing against the alternatives or the non-animal research already, without looking too far into the future, but even now they are. we need to get a lot cleverer at promoting that argument. And one other thing I'll say, that I was in Oxford on Thursday, and it's interesting. It's very interesting at the moment, because you'd think with everything with COVID going on and the background talk about some of the animal experimentation that's gone on, that there'd be a kind of bit of a public backlash against us there. And I can tell you now, it's the opposite. I've never experienced so much support from the public, which I find not only encouraging, but I also think, well, there's clearly a sizable portion of the population out there that is still and is very much questioning animal experiments. And the more they hear a dual argument, I mean, they're already on board with the moral argument. I think we're all fairly clear on that. But the more they can hear that scientifically the moral argument is backed up, then the stronger that backlash or that backswell, grows. But it's definitely there, and even myself was surprised at the level of support we're getting from people, in Oxford. It's quite staggering, actually.
It sounds like being outside of the laboratory is a lot safer than being out near a hunt. So maybe you stick with that for a little while, eh?
Well, that brings us to Lynn's comment, doesn't it? That actually being at a vivisection action and was seriously injured by a police officer. So, I think the violence is across, isn't it? But yeah, generally the statement probably stands.
Yeah.
What I would say to that, I mean, I found what Mel just said was really interesting. Going back to what Wendy said, it's usually, I tend to have found it's the other way around, that rather than the moral position was critical of the scientific anti-vivisection thing, it was more the other way around, that the scientific anti-vivisection position was critical of the moral thing. And that came to the fore with the work of Hans Royce, who was very famous in the 80s, I'll say it. And so, there is a famous film called Hidden Crimes, and it's on YouTube. It's in about 8 parts. I think on part 7, where you can see a march, they are attacking the moral argument on the basis that human beings are selfish, and so therefore you can't win anything by making the moral argument. However, the moral argument has always supported the scientific anti-vivisection argument, as far as I'm aware. But what I tend to do is keep them apart. So Mel was saying about bringing them together. I would tend to talk about them as separate things. So I would talk about scientific anti-vivisection arguments, and then on top of that, the moral position, it kind of like makes it irrelevant, as Wendy said, to some degree anyway. Because if it just so happened that there was some science that was crucial from the vivisection point of view, it still wouldn't pass the moral test. So it's not quite that the moral position is opposed to the science position. It's more to do with that. It's a separate issue, I think. But
we got it.
One thing can talk about the other, I think.
Yeah, we got a question actually before the show that might be interesting for us to ponder briefly. Is I will be running a social media campaign for the local animal rights org I volunteer for on experimentation/vivisection. Are there any tips or main points that I should focus on? And I guess the challenging thing here is specifically social media. I'm assuming it's fairly brief interactions with the content. So it sounds like, from what I'm hearing, is having a strong focus on both the moral and the scientific position, and maybe finding a way to blend those, or perhaps keep them separate, to your point, Roger.
I think it depends on what you regard as the scientific position. For example, I'd be interested in Mel's view on this, in the sense that if you go back to the the kind of Hans Royce kind of position, he would almost like argue that there's never ever been a single animal experiment that has created data which was useful for humans, and so on that basis alone, people should reject it. Nothing to do with morals. Whereas I think the animal rights stance is to keep the moral argument there anyway, because that tends to say, well, even if that's not true, it's still a rights violation.
And I think it's probably quite dangerous to take a position and say that nothing has ever been learned from any animal experiments. I think that is probably dishonest. There probably are moments in the past where some things were learned. That doesn't mean that from a moral point of view, obviously it justifies it, but it means that at some point in the past, before there was even an animal rights movement or anything else, there were experiments going on that did elucidate some things about living systems. They're not relevant now, and it would be ridiculous of us to try and argue that that has never ever happened. And also, it's almost like putting a loaded gun to your own head, really. I think, in terms of an argument against vivisection, far more that in the 21st century, particularly, and this is not to justify anything that happened before, we are now in a situation where we do not need to experiment on animals, and we also know there are good statistics about the abysmal failure of drug testing on animals. The failure rate is very, very high, and that's the issue that's most pertinent to in a contemporary sort of setting. I've always been uncomfortable with making sweeping statements about there's never ever been an experiment on an animal that hasn't proved something. To me, they only have to come up with one example when you've literally blown everything else out of the water, when you don't need to do that. You just, that's something you don't need to do. So I'd be careful of that.
Yeah, I was going to say, just to speak on that and what Mel's saying, I think we have to be real and just acknowledge that we, probably the majority of us, or most of us, have taken like a medicine or a kind of drug that has been tested on animals, and we have experienced benefit through the violation of their rights, the systemic issue, and that's what Tom Reagan, I guess, would call an ill-gotten gain, which we benefited from.
The argument against that, though, Tom, would be that those products are on the market despite the animal tests, and really the animal test was just a legal requirement to get to the human trials. And it's once you get to the human trials that's when you actually get data that is meaningful. It's just that because they want to protect themselves, they place this animal section before the human bit.
Yeah, and I think Roger's made a very, very important point there. Absolutely, 100%. That is a very, very important point.
The one thing I was just going to also ask, and it's kind of just a point to make, but also a question to Mel as well, because in following the previous question about things that the person can do to help them with their vivisection campaign, the one thing that springs to mind for me is to what the work that Mel's doing, speaking with scientists who are kind of engaging in these practices. I watched a short film called The Test Subjects, which features 3 individuals who were it shows their conditioning and how they're conditioned to use animals in their study, but they actively chose to kind of resist and kind of move away from that. But I wonder if that's helpful, highlighting the cases where scientists have kind of acknowledged the immorality and the rights violations and the ineffectiveness in it, and getting case studies from people like them who are actually kind of involved in this industry, and wonder if Mel knows anyone personally who he speaks with who've kind of taken a different view from being involved and then coming away from it.
In actual fact, this is just pre-COVID, so last summer I actually had a couple of very interesting conversations with some first-year medical students at Oxford who had come for an open day, who were looking to train into being doctors and researchers. And they went into a seminar. We happened to be there on the Thursday afternoon when this was going on. And the medical training centre is literally right on the opposite side to the lab where we stand. So we see these people all the time. And I had 2 young, both women, who came out of the introductory talk and walked straight up to us, and I had a conversation with them. They said, look, I came here, I want to be a doctor, and I've just been told by this person in the medical training centre at Oxford that the first thing they have to talk about is you've got to do animal experiments. And she just got up and said, I'm not coming to this university. And I had a long conversation with her. She said, I intend to be a doctor, but I won't do it off the backs of experiment on animals. And it happened twice that day. So I've met these kind of these young people that I'm starting to meet are really inspirational. Some of them, you know, they are looking to be the future medics, doctors and researchers, and some of them are finally saying, I'm not doing it this way. And to have them come out of one of these seminars and talk to us like that is incredible. And I get the feeling that, and it's one of the things that I think we should all be proud of in our movement, is that we're responsible for this. It's us that's doing this. And the more, again, we come back to this, I think I'm going to backtrack on one of my comments. Roger was right. They actually do have to be separate arguments. He is right about that. I do agree now, thinking about it, that when we talk to these people, the more that we can show that we are conversant with some of the scientific arguments, the more we influence them. I suspect that in both the cases of the young women I spoke to, they already had a sympathy for the animal rights position. I got that impression. But at the same time, because they were learning from the animal rights movement and also from the scientific community that there is another way of doing this, and that they can still pursue this career, this important career. And I always make a point saying to them that what they're doing is valuable, that we need research. I never poo-poo that, you know. It's important we have research, absolutely important. We all probably may depend on it one day. I know I already have, you know. But the more that they can understand, especially when it comes from people like us, that we're also understanding their position and support their position, want to be researchers, but also are understanding that there are other ways of doing research, and that we're also reasonably conversant with it, the more credible we become as well. So I think from the perspective of campaigning, particularly against animal experiments, I've come to really realise this, having come from the same position that Roger did in the 80s and 90s, and I was heavily involved in the anti-vivisection side of things then, but it was very much this is cruel, this is torturing animals, which is all correct. We were light on any other argument, you know, and I suspect if you look historically at the anti-vivisection movement, going right back to the turn of the 20th century, these things keep happening. And certainly the last manifestation that has got to have been what happened, you know, around 2006-7 with the closing down of Shack, the SNGP, and ultimately what happened with us in Oxford, is that because we were portrayed just as being bunny huggers basically and light on the scientific argument, we'd lost. And I particularly remember at the time that I tried very hard to encourage some of the scientific people who were in the background who were trying to speak out, people who were from you know, safer medicines and such, but essentially they were nervous about being seen alongside the activist space, and it created that kind of division, which I still look back on with great regret, because I think it did us enormous damage. And I personally, that has to be avoided this time round if we're going to succeed. It has to be avoided. Now, how that fits in with the question, which I think we're discussing, is the two approach, the kind of rights and the scientific one. In some ways, I think it does wholeheartedly, in the sense that they're kind of science-based arguments. I mean, to think that the rights argument always has to be there, but we have to show that we have an understanding and even a sympathy with the scientific community as it tries to sort of advance. Because if we don't, we're going to repeat the mistakes of the past, and I'm really worried. That worries me greatly. You know.
Well, one strong part of that, though, would be, I mean, to point out to one point that some of the early physicians, they researched on themselves because, and the ironic reason why they did that is because they realized that they needed to research on humans, and they thought that was morally wrong. So the only humans that they were willing to research on was themselves. And that conversely feeds into what happened in the Second World War, when the Americans in particular did a deal with the Nazi doctors, and particularly the Japanese doctors, to get the data from the human experiments that were going on, because there's a recognition that the logic of vivisection is to do it on humans, because, you know, obviously there's no point in doing it on the wrong species, which is why, you know, you can't go to a vet to get medication. because they'll say, well, it doesn't extrapolate. Well, it goes the other way as well. And so there is a recognition within the scientific community that species difference is probably one of the biggest problems with vivisection completely. And that's why they actually wanted the human data. So knowing about the science is important, but knowing about the history of the development of things is also important, I'd say.
Yeah, I mean, an example that immediately jumps to mind with me, which I reread again recently, and it's worth looking this stuff up, is stroke research. I mean, the sort of extrapolation from primates, supposed closest relative to humans in stroke research, is abysmal. It's terrible, And these examples, the industry, research is littered with these examples, and the more you learn about it, the more credible, obviously, you sound when you can quote this stuff. But it does paint a picture of a research methodology that always was poor, but in a modern technologically advanced age is worse than poor. And morally, you can argue that, well, why are you still wasting? Surely it's a moral question as well to waste valuable research money on a method that is so poor. When the alternative, that modern technological methods are much better. And I think there's one other important thing here, and I've seen a lot of advocates fall into the trap here. It's completely erroneous and incorrect to try and argue that there's a magic bullet here. There isn't going to be one technological advancement that replaces animal experiments. What there's going to be, and what's already happening, is a raft of them that, used in a holistic way, will produce results. But I've heard some advocates try to argue that, it's computer modeling will end it all. No, computer modeling won't end it all. Computer modeling coupled with cell lines, microfluid chip technology, nanotechnology, and all the rest of things will produce methodologies that are already equaling animal experiments and passing them. So, I would urge people, be careful when you talk about technology as well, not to fall into the trap of trying to promote this this holy grail of a technology, this single technology that will replace animals. That's not how it will happen.
Well, of course, what is a holy grail, though, to some extent, is, ironically, the moral argument. If we can defeat cultural speciesism, that in itself then would end all animal experimentation, because no one would do it on moral grounds.
Yeah.
And that seems to be echoed through the comments. I mean, that's the key for me, because I think the moral argument, talking about how all animals are unique individuals, and it's violating their rights to test on them and use them, is kind of step one. And then to start accumulating the scientific evidence to have that as well to bolt on, I think is a really solid approach.
Yeah, I wouldn't, argue against that. So the only case I'm trying to make is that as animal rights campaigners or advocates or whatever, we do have to also make sure that we're as strong as we can be on backing up that with the technological arguments as well, because often I've found it to be coupled with a rights argument and the moral argument to be a winner, even when I've argued with animal researchers. It does work. And I think, as I said earlier, I think even I fell into the trap of believing that after what happened to Shaq and us in Oxford, that there was almost a complete shutdown in debate about animal research. At one time, you would have had 20 years ago, the controversy, you would always had a debate from both sides, even if it was animal rights advocates as often was against scientists, which was always grossly unfair. But what has happened is that got shut down as we got labelled extremists and kind of sidelined. It shut that debate down. And so if you see news articles now concerning animal experimentation, you will not hear an opposing argument anymore from our side, so to speak. And probably the only place that's going to come from now is a scientist who's working on non-animal research. It's not going to come from an animal rights advocate. They just don't allow it anymore. Unless someone can tell me they've heard of one in the last 10, 15 years. I haven't in the media. I just haven't heard one.
But don't all the vivisection groups still have scientific advisors? Angela Walder and Robert Sharp and all that.
Yeah, but Roger, you probably know as well as I do that in terms of national anti-vivisection societies, here in the UK, they're pretty much non-functional now in terms of any output, really. NAV certainly, the BUAV, well, you know yourself. Animal aid, I suppose the focus has shifted from animal experiments to the main promotion of veganism. So in terms of a kind of national anti-vivisection voice that probably comes from the animal rights side of the argument, it doesn't, as far as I can see, it doesn't exist anymore. It hasn't done for some time. Whether I would like to think that will change, I'm not sure whether it will. I mean, there's certainly room for it.
Well, maybe the grassroots can do it. If only we could figure a way out to get some.
Always bringing up the funding.
I think actually, as well,
I think Roger does raise. I think he raises a really important point about the grassroots doing it. An actual fact, I think yes, why not? An intelligent grassroots body speaking up for laboratory animals is very much needed. It's very much needed.
it's like you said, Mel. Actually,
Sorry, Wendy.
No, I was just going to say it's because Tom mentioned the test subjects and Mel mentioned those students, and I think that's really quite a really positive point, actually, because I think some of the change will definitely need to come from within the industry itself, and people like Animal Free Research UK and the amazing groundbreaking work they're doing and pushing the envelope inside the industry. However, like Mel alluded to earlier, those students, you know, they have an awareness of animal rights. Why? Because of grassroots activists pushing that message continually since the 1980s, and we have to keep that going and bring that back more and more strongly. Grassroots and industry, people working within the industry to push that message as well. And I know it's difficult for them because they're conditioned and it's systemized conditioning. It's so ingrained in that industry, but I think if more and more of those students and these young inspiring people can push that, then that's where change will really come. I do believe that.
And I think you also have to, I mean, an encouraging thing that's been happening over the last couple of months is that I've been in discussions with a few people, and there are now campaigns started at a few universities, including Leicester, Newcastle. The campaign against Covance, which used to be HLS, has now resumed. MBR, Interfor, and the campaign has now resumed. So there is, and it's coming from the grassroots again, and which is really encouraging. But I would say this time round, it has to be a bit different. However much we'd want it to go back to the 1980s and all that kind of 90s and all that kind of high energy, direct action fueled campaigning, I think realistically that probably isn't going to happen. But that doesn't mean to say that these new campaigns can't reach an equal level of effectiveness by, producing and acting on, more contemporary arguments, if you like. At the same time, still being grassroots campaigns. I mean, we still stand outside Oxford, and I think there's a place for this because one thing I have learned over the years that the Oxford campaign has been going on is that we're known in Oxford now. People know us, and we get people. I saw someone on Thursday who I hadn't seen for about 10 years came and said, "Oh, you're still here then?" And we're kind of a part of the fixture and fittings of Oxford life now, and that I think is a good thing because the question continues to be asked all the time about animal research. We're talking to people all the time. And so I think the more that the grassroots movement can become a public focus by being at these laboratories, and even if it is, just standing outside protesting, then it again pulls the focus back on these places. Because the thing about them is they're anonymous looking buildings. A lot of people often come and say, "I didn't realise that was a lab." They walk past it every day. And they said, "Well, there's animals in there being experimented." Yeah. Oh, I walked past this lab for the last 10 years. I didn't know that. So there's this kind of things with particularly with laboratory owners, this anonymity, they don't exist, but they do. And the grassroots movement, in whatever it does, has always been good at breaking that, whether it was through raids, high profile daylight occupations or whatever, has always been very, very good
all the
making
best
people
things from the grassroots, and with funding, the grassroots could employ or encourage the scientific advisors, so the grassroots could be scientifically informed. Anyway, so Mel, when they said, "Oh, you're still here," and you said, "What? Yeah, I'm still here, but don't ask me to go through a metal detector." Is that what you said?
Something like that. Something like that.
Well, and to Sharon's point, I don't know if we could maybe recommend one or two key sources that if people want to start getting to strengthened on the scientific side of things, any resources that either yourself, Mel, or anyone on anyone would like to recommend that have been helpful for them. I know the Speaks website is quite good for that.
Yeah, I mean, there are things like cruelty-free research, and also I read something very good recently. It's free online about it's called Animal Experiments: A Paradigm Shift, and it's a series of articles by people involved in non-animal research, scientists and so on and so forth, about the scientific arguments of animal research, also incorporating some of the animal rights position. It's a good resource. It's very current, so it's got the latest kind of research thinking in it by people who are involved. So it's some of it's a bit heavy, but it's one of those things that is worth looking at. I would urge people do some research if you're going to go out. If it's outreach or talking to people or being involved in anything to do with with an issue like this, have some basic background knowledge. It's always best to come across with something, to show that you have some background knowledge. I think people respond better and take you more seriously. But I would urge people to do that, do some research. But ultimately, as Roger said, and he's quite right, and I'm a massive advocate of the grassroots animal rights, and we've always have been and continue to be. And I think, it's perfect within our gift to raise this issue once again right up there.
Going back to the comment about campaigns, anti-vivisection campaigns on social media, we are talking about language here a lot. And what I want to ask is, do you feel that vivisection is a word well understood by the general audience? What do you usually when you converse with, not with scientists, with common people?
The first thing I would say about the word vivisection is it's not used at all now. I think the dictionary definition is the cutting up of live animals. The research industries themselves never use it, because what they would say is we're mostly involved in producing genetic lines, and a lot of our research doesn't involve actually surgically altering animals. So it's a word that is not used very much now. We still use it in Oxford sometimes. We still have some placards with it on. But in terms of its general usage, it's one that isn't used very much now. Animal experiments are now known as procedures. Again, the language change is deliberate. Obviously, procedure sounds better than experiment or vivisection. I suppose from a purely animal rights perspective, it makes little difference whether you die as a result of being genetically modified experimented on, or being surgically experimented on, then dying. Difference is of no issue. The suffering's there, and the end result's the same. But in terms of the actual word vivisection itself, I had a very interesting conversation with some guy from Oxford last year who took offence at the word vivisection being on a poster. We don't do that anymore. We don't cut animals up. I knew what it was about. It was about just shifting the argument. Well, we don't cut them up. They still die in great numbers here as part of genetic modification and other research. But we don't actually cut them up.
It becomes a welfare discussion, doesn't it?
Exactly,
it becomes a welfare discussion, doesn't it? Versus not using them at all.
Yeah.
And that's, to your point, I guess
Mm.
that's the question here on the screen is the vivisection really is specific to the cutting. I think that's the general etymology of it, but
yeah. I mean, there's been a whole. Sorry, Roger.
No, I was just going to say, someone like Joan DeMere would say we should use vivisection and not use the industry terms, because they would want us to do that. They'd want us to say sacrifice rather than kill and all that. But it would take a lot of ripening up. And also, there is this argument about whether you go back to the archaic meaning of vivisection means cut while alive, whereas it came to mean animal experiments in more general sense. So there has always been an ambiguity about it. But also, just as a word, it's probably not a well-known word. So then there's a question mark about whether to use it or not.
I think it's known amongst activists more than anything. Animal rights activists are really the people who use it and understand it, and it has that emotive effect.
Is
But
it worth ripening people up then? You see, that's the point, isn't it? Or not, you know.
Or be more objective and talking about breeding, using and killing other animals for testing or experiments, or
be more descriptive. I mean,
more descriptive
doesn't say anything, does it, to anyone?
I one of the words I'm still mostly offended by, I still find shocking, is when laboratory animals are described as tools. You know, tools. I just find that incredibly offensive. And yet they're still used. You know, you still see it in scientific literature, animal tools or animal models. I just find that.
But isn't it that the way they distance themselves from the actual individuals that they are killing and using, it's almost they're putting that somewhere in their brain. They can compartmentalize it to the point that they can carry on doing such horrific rights violations of these individual people.
It's just a scientific version of the farmers saying units of production, and in terms of the deaths of fishes, the fact that they're not even seen as individuals anyway, and so they're just counted in terms of weight. So they're all distancing mechanisms there.
Yeah, and that seems to be echoed in the comments here, because being the Animal Rights Show, we have to bring it back to Reagan every now and then, and I believe Reagan himself talks about tools or models and research, which I hadn't thought about that one before, but that's a really, really strong point. I think just real quickly, Elliot highlights a inconsistency that maybe we could consider for our outreach, which is specifically that while at the same time, quote, researchers, they're not morally against testing on other animals because they're different than humans, but then at the same time, they say that they, they're fine to test on, so it's to get data from. So it's like you can't have it both ways. They're either different or they're similar. So
but they want it. They want it both ways, in the same way as hunters say they're pest controllers and also guardians of the countryside. They've always wanted it both ways all the time.
Yeah, and here's another use of the word tool being mentioned, and just another echoing that, using that objective language. And I think whatever language we choose to use, we just have to be prepared, as we all, I think, know probably, and those watching, where the conversation might go, and be prepared to back it up.
No, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, with that, I mean, I think this has been a fantastic discussion. We could easily keep things going, but just a massive thank you for joining us, Mel. This has been a real honor. We've covered a lot of ground, I think. But let's keep the conversation going in the comments, because it's not just about the six of us. It's about everyone out there and building that community and continuing the exploration of these ideas.
Well, thank you for inviting me on. It's been a real pleasure. I've really enjoyed it. It's been, as I always say about these things, I always learn stuff as well. So yeah, thank you to everyone.
Oh, thanks for coming, Mel.
All I want to say, Mel, is stop throwing yourself at horses, okay?
Cheers, Roger. Got ya.
Like suffragettes.
See everyone next week.
Yeah.
Bye.
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 Bye.